Hi, kiddos. Today we will be taking a look at the story Confucius Says. Confucius Says by Stephen Curry. Early that morning, the gossip began. It flew around the court from one person to the next, like a little bird with a wagging tongue. The Duke of Lu was ill, whispered a kitchen maid. No, the royal breakfast had been burned, said a carpenter. No, bad news had been received from abroad, insisted a tax collector. As always, there were 100 different people telling 100 different stories. I readied my brush and my ink and my scrolls. As the Duke's official scribe, I knew I would soon enough hear the truth. Indeed, well before the midday meal, the Duke called me. I am ashamed to say I took my time. It was a clear, crisp spring morning, and I took a roundabout route through the royal gardens on my way to his side. There were many good roses in full bloom, and even more birds flitting about singing. Their charms are always hard to resist. So I was a few minutes late arriving at the court. The Duke wore his finest robes and sat on his official seat. His face was red and his eyes bulged with fury. It was clear he was having great difficulty controlling himself. At first, I stayed back, fearing that I had angered him by being late. But I quickly saw that this was not the case. Instead, he was glaring at three men who stood across from him. I knew them all: the Duke's librarian, the head gardener, and the chief cook. Their hands were tied by ropes, and an armed guard stood behind each one. The men looked frightened, worried, and most of all miserable. Indeed, I had never before seen three such miserable men. I made a bow, gave an apology, and began to set up my tools. Only then did I happen to notice the other men in the room. My head jerked up, and I drew a deep breath. Confucius, I whispered. Confucius! I had often heard of this great man, a philosopher and thinker who lived here in Lu. He sometimes advised the Duke on important matters. The problem with China, Confucius often said, was that it was not moral enough. These were troubled times. People cheated one another and were quick to use violence. Even those who seemed honest too often turned out to be the opposite. Confucius was trying to tame society, to bring back goodness and respect. And even if you preferred the teachings of his rival, Lao Tzu, you had to see that much of what Confucius said was true. I could not believe my great good luck. I had seen his portrait, of course, but I had never seen Confucius in person. I bowed low, so low my brushes tumbled from my grasp. Embarrassed, I picked them up and bowed a second time. The great man gravely returned my bow, which impressed me. After all, I was only a simple scribe. And he was Confucius. I bowed a third time just to be sure. The modest are near to virtue, Confucius told me. But two bows would have been sufficient, he added. He had spoken directly to me. This time I was so excited I managed to drop my scroll. I will come right to the point, the Duke scowled at the three men opposite him. Of these three, one of these three is a thief. One of these men has stolen a precious jade piece from my collection, a small green bird about the size of my hand. I wrote furiously, trying to keep up with the flow of words. The story was clear enough. The piece was extremely valuable. Why, the jade alone was worth thousands. The carving was beautiful. It was among the Duke's favorite pieces of art. It had occupied a place of honor in the palace. Last night it was in my chambers. The Duke concluded. This morning it was gone. My guards saw these men and no others near my chambers during the night. Therefore, one of them must have taken it. He turned to Confucius. Is it not so? The cautious seldom make mistakes, the great man said. I unrolled one more scroll and wrote down Confucius's words. It was easy to see what he was getting at. Instead of accusing everybody in sight, Confucius was saying, wait and hear the evidence. Oh, murmured the Duke. I see. He frowned. Well, what have you got to say for yourselves? My lord, said the librarian, I am a simple man and I have simple tastes. I was at your chambers to bring you a book of poetry. I came with the book and I left with nothing. He licked his lip nervously and went on. I do not have this bird. I have never seen it. You may search my chambers, my library, my person. I have worked for you for these 10 years and more. Surely you cannot think, you must not think, that I would ever. Confucius tapped his chin. To go beyond is as wrong as to fall short, he said gently. I smiled to myself. Again, the great man's meaning was clear. The librarian was protesting too much. I dipped my brush into the ink and wrote. The gardener spoke up. I have also never seen the piece, my lord. I know nothing of this small green bird in flight. I came to your chambers to tell you that your roses were in bloom, but you did not speak with me. When I tried to tell you again this morning, I was seized. I was not told why until just now. His eyes brimmed with tears. The roses are beautiful, my lord. I have worked hard, my lord. The man cleared his throat. All eyes turned to him. Things that are done, it is needless to speak about, he said. I nodded and wrote. Confucius was quite right. The beauty of the roses had nothing to do with the missing piece. I. The cook seemed tongue tied. I only wanted to ask you about the menu, my lord. That was all. I. His voice trailed off. I didn't know about any jade bird. When you do not know a thing, to admit that you do not know it, said Confucius. That is wisdom. May I? Maybe I should just choose one and put him in jail, sighed the Duke. A little torture. The librarian gasped. The gardener turned pale. The cook's eyes bulged with fear. The best kind of man, said Confucius, does not set his mind either for or against anything. What is right is what he will follow. The Duke sighed. I asked you here to help me, not to recite riddles with no point. Confucius stirred and leaned forward. I am not one who was born in the possession of knowledge. I wrote quickly. To me, Confucius's meaning was clear. Knowledge was gained by listening, not by thinking that you knew all the answers already. Careful listening could tell us the truth, could tell us which man had stolen the piece. I stretched the scroll and looked back at what I had written. Suddenly, I knew where the jade piece was and who had taken it. I put down my brush. My lord, my voice was husky and low. My lord, if I may. Yes, scribe. The Duke frowned in my direction. I got to my feet and bowed, and then bowed again. My lord, if you would send a guard into the royal garden, you will find your jade bird, I said. It was on the branch of a brush, I explained. I told him as nearly as I could exactly which one and where. What? The cry came from the gardener. My lord, you must not. The Duke silenced him with a look. He nodded to one of the other guards who left the room. A minute or two later, he returned with a small green bird. Its wings were outstretched as if in flight. Very impressive, said the Duke, and a good place to hide a bird in a garden with dozens of others just like it. Tell me, scribe, how did you know? I was in the garden this morning, I said, not explaining how I had come to be there. I saw a great many birds. All were singing except this one. I thought perhaps it was a mute. But as I listened to you and these men, I realized that it was your piece of art. Confucius smiled. Virtue is at hand, he murmured. My chest swelled with pride. The gardener's lips curled. That means nothing, he argued. Other people use the garden. Someone else may have stolen the bird and hidden it. You have no proof. Oh, but I do, I said, and I slowly unrolled the scroll before me. All three of you said you had never seen it. My lord the Duke described it to us. I found the exact words and read them back. He called it a small green bird about the size of my hand. And, demanded the gardener, I took the figure from the guard and set it in my palm, being especially careful of the outstretched wings. The Duke said nothing about the position of the bird, but you alone knew that the figure showed a bird in flight. I jammed my forefinger at his words from earlier that morning. In flight. How did you know that? I asked him, if you had never seen the bird before. The gardener's body sagged and the life went out of his eyes. Put him in the dungeon, sighed the Duke. The best kind of man is modest in his speech, said Confucius, but does well in his actions. And he smiled broadly at me. The end. Let's take a quick stretch break before we move on to our two comprehension questions. Why do you think Confucius used short, riddle-like statements to explain his philosophy instead of telling people directly what he meant?